What a big house. Let's talk about sex. Peter, thanks for joining us today. We have a very full house. I think folks can pose questions to us up here, which we will read in just a bit. But Peter, I wanted to, one of the things I've been doing today, and some of the subjects, been talking about religion, refugee crisis, and others, is to imagine a world before the one we were in, where we did not have technology and apps and data on everything we see today. And I'm interested to know from you, you've been an activist in this world for 52 years, I just learned. How has the scene changed? How has sexual identity changed?
Well, I guess my starting point is that lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender identity largely came into existence in response to oppression. Our sexuality and gender identity was the reason we were targeted for persecution, and therefore we had to defend it. And that is why we have an LGBT plus movement, to defend our community against the persecution we face.
And where did that oppression come from?
Primarily through organized religion, but also through various extreme political ideologies, fascism and communism.
And so one of the things we see, not around the world, but I'd love to get your dashboard on how you see that state of oppression today and the state of homophobia today, if you will, or the broad intolerance over sexual identity. What does the world look like today as you look at it?
Well, there are still 66 countries that criminalize same-sex relations, with penalties ranging from a few years right up to life imprisonment. And there are 10 Muslim-majority countries that have the death penalty for homosexuality. Overall, though, the trend is going in the right direction. 40 years ago, there were over 100 countries that criminalized same-sex relations. Now it's down to 66. And most recently, Botswana, India, Angola, Trinidad and Tobago have decriminalized same-sex relations, and the Himalayan kingdom of Bhutan, its lower house has just passed a bill for decriminalization, which should be seconded by the upper house in December. So we are making progress, but there is a backlash in about 20 countries: Russia, Indonesia, Uganda, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Ethiopia, Tanzania. These are countries that are going backwards. There are about 20 in total, but that's 20 in total out of 193 countries. So I think we are going in the right direction.
You didn't mention the United States.
Well, the United States is obviously going backwards, but not to the extreme extent of many of these countries.
I just wanted, and I mentioned the United States because some people around the world, we're in Portugal here, of course, don't realize that transgendered rights were achieved with serving in the United States military. Those have now collapsed, and it's prompted many of us looking at the kind of broad rights question to wonder how fragile those rights are. So let's take the UK. How fragile is the rights regime for the LGBTQ community in the UK?
Well, just to give you a flavor, in Britain, the Social Attitude Survey in the late 1980s found that over 2/3 of the British public believed that homosexuality was mostly or always wrong. Now it's down to a mere 16%. And even of those 16%, many may think it is wrong, but they wouldn't necessarily treat a LGBT person badly. So I think that's a trend we're seeing across Western Europe as a whole. Not so much in the United States, but in Western Europe. And my view is, if this trend continues, what's going to be the long-term implications? If same-sex relations are no longer the big issue they once were, how is that going to impact? And I think we're going to see, in all probability, a greater experimentation and exploration of same-sex behavior by people who wouldn't necessarily find themselves as gay or lesbian or bisexual, but people who are open to the possibility. Now, in Britain, we have surveys which show that among young people, over 20% have had a same-sex experience. Over 20%. A recent survey in Britain found that 49% of British young people said they would not define themselves as 100% straight. Now, this is an incredibly groundbreaking move in youth consciousness. And I think if it continues, and there's no reason why it shouldn't,
right,
and I think it will continue all across Western Europe on similar lines, then I think we're going to reach towards a post-homophobic society where the differences between LGBT and straight no longer matter. In those circumstances, will it be any longer necessary to assert LGBT plus identities? I don't think so, because if no one's making a fuss about it, if acceptance is across the board, we don't need to fight like we once used to. Of course, there are still battles to fight and win, but not on the scale of the past.
You know, it is interesting. We did have originally a third person who was going to join us up here, and unfortunately she couldn't join because of a family crisis, and she was in the sort of tech side of this and the pleasure in tech side of this, which we're not going to be able to get into as thoroughly, but it raises part of the question. I talked to Mitchell Baker and some of her people from Mozilla today. Mozilla actually did a study. They released it on Valentine's Day, and it was called Privacy Not Included. And it had to do with the purchase of sex toys and various apps, various things in sort of the broad sex and tech area, and how because of the lack of privacy dimensions built in, these could be vulnerable. And it comes to your point where, to some degree, sexual identity has been in some places weaponized. And I'm interested, as you think about the tech world, do you think I mean, I know you have the view that we're going in the right direction, but do you think the weaponization of sexual identity is something that concerns you when you get in the tech area?
It does concern me, but I think it's very limited in the damage it can do, because the trend is towards greater understanding, acceptance, respect, and rights. And I think we're going to, in the not too distant future, in Western societies, not the rest of the world, but in Western societies, reach a point where LGBT and straight don't really have any much social significance or relevance, because most people won't care who you love and have sex with. And that, to me, is a great liberation. If we can get out of these boxes into which we're being pigeonholed,
right,
and accept that perhaps in the future, more people will explore different aspects of their sexuality and gender identity, that idea is, to me, incredibly liberating. Because we're not boxes. We're not people who are made to fit in boxes. And I think these traditional parameters have been suffocating for many people, including many straight people. And to me, this is one of the great things about the LGBT plus liberation movement. What we're fighting for is love and let love, live and let live, sex with who you want, with consent. And that will liberate straight people as much as LGBT ones.
Powerful comment. Thank you for that. Let me ask you about your activism, which has taken place over so many decades now. I'm always interested in things that have gone in the right direction, and I know in just my few minutes with you, you're ferocious. You are a Jason Bourne type. You like to help people, but you're also modest. But I'm interested in what you saw as having worked as an activist. What were the things that moved the needle successfully on the rights agenda you worked on? And what were your blind spots? What didn't go as well as you thought? Because we have a lot of folks that are now, I love this conference and I love the people I meet, because I meet so many who want to give scale and power and connectivity to issues that matter. And I think that sexual identity and freedom of sexual identity is a vital one. And I have known people personally who have paid very high prices for the lack of privacy and the weaponization of this. But what has worked for you as an activist? What hasn't worked?
Well, let me say that I grew up as a teenager in the 1960s, before there was a really organized LGBT plus movement. So I didn't have a reference point when I began at the age of 17. So I looked to the Black civil rights movement in America as the model, the template, how to do successful activism. And I understood that African Americans had fought through the traditional political process for decades. They'd got nowhere. And it was only when the Black Power movement came along, when Martin Luther King and the Black civil rights movement began, that things really changed. It was their model of nonviolent direct action and civil disobedience that put African American rights on the political agenda and ultimately forced the Congress and president to change. So that was my template, because in the 1960s, even the 1970s and 80s, it was so difficult to get mainstream politicians to take LGBT plus rights seriously. So the way we did it, the way I did it with my colleagues, was to use nonviolent, direct action, and civil disobedience, challenging homophobic individuals and institutions face to face. And like the Black Civil Rights Movement people, I've been arrested over 100 times. I've had death threats, hate mail, but I can look back and see that not me, but our collective endeavor has brought us to a fantastic place, which, when I was a teenager, we only dreamed of. And that is down to collective action, not just by LGBT plus people, but also by our straight friends and allies who've walked with us, who've marched with us, who've stood with us in this long battle for freedom.
How does the Peter Tatchell Foundation, to the degree it does, interact with this emerging data? You brought data that you just shared about same-sex experiences. I was interested in going back to some of the writing on the Kinsey scale and Alfred Kinsey and what we're learning. And these are less robust numbers than you just shared, but YouGov found that 89% of people identify as straight, 6% gay. But if you ask them to put themselves on the Kinsey scale, which I'm going to ask you to share with our audience what that means, that number 89 falls to 72%. That number of gay falls from 6% to 4%. So people are obviously seeing them in a different shades of gray, so to speak. So I am interested in this question of whether or not thinking in less binary fixes, boxes as you said it, and technology in a way gives us lots of opportunities and pathways to experiment, to see, to encounter. I just had a conversation with Tony Campolo, who did not have as robust and friendly a view of technology as I do. But I'm interested in whether or not that experimentation, that changing of one's culture is something you see in numbers that we not. I'm wondering what the Tatchell Foundation has to share on that front.
Well, I think you're right that research and data is absolutely crucial to provide the evidence as to why social change is necessary. So in Britain, in the 80s and 90s, when we had such an uphill, obdurate battle to get LGBT rights on the political agenda, when we were able to show the politicians that public opinion was moving in favor of LGBT plus equality, that gave politicians the confidence that they could vote for gay law reform. So that evidence was really, really important. And likewise today, when we look at the evolving nature of human sexuality, if we want to change laws, if we want to change the way in which institutions operate, we need the data. We need the data to show why it's necessary for the improvement and betterment of people's lives.
We have a lot of questions coming in from all which we will get through these. We've got some time to go through them. But let me ask you about the boxes and then what it's like inside the LGBT activist world. I interviewed Andrew Sullivan, the writer, the correspondent. He made a very provocative thing. When I was at the Atlantic magazine, I was proud that the Atlantic magazine became the first mainstream publication in the US to have a super summit editorially on LGBT issues. This was not an activist or a forum, essentially of advocacy. It was one editorially exploring it, which meant you had to bring in people with controversial and provocative notions on this too. And Andrew said the L's don't like the G's, don't like the B's, and don't like the T's. That we presume that there's a unity of spirit and commitment between these various groups. And to some degree, when you look at, because I've been active in trying to support for many of people I know transgender rights, but there's been an antipathy in the lesbian, gay, bisexual community about transgendered rights. So I'm interested in, do we make a mistake by globbing all these groups in and not understanding the tectonics inside this identity?
Well, you're right. There are differences between lesbians, gay men, bisexuals, and transgender people. There are differences, but we have a common experience of persecution.
Right.
And we are all gender nonconformists. We don't fit the traditional orthodox patterns of expectations about the way in which men and women are supposed to behave. And that unity, that common ground of gender nonconformity and persecution gives us the basis to work together.
And do you think that right now where you see transgendered rights collapsing, say in the United States, in my view, it's not a good scene. I don't see the broader portions of the LGBT community as active as I can feel just on this stage from you. Does that concern you?
It does, but all the main LGBT plus groups in the United States are supporting transgender rights, as they are here in Western Europe. And I think, sadly, trans people have been left behind, and the LGBT movement in the past has not been so inclusive. But I think there is a catch-up going on, and we are battling right now in Britain to get a reform of our Gender Recognition Act to ensure that trans people don't have to go through all the medical hoops and hurdles to get a legal change in their identity, that they can do it through statutory declaration, as has happened in Ireland, Malta, Argentina, and other countries.
Let's take some of the questions from the floor. We have Charlotte, who asks about porn, violent porn. How is more and more mainstream violent porn influencing sexuality?
Well, of course, undoubtedly, certain types of pornography are now becoming quite mainstream. They're accessible to people of all ages. And there is a worrying concern that for young people who are not getting adequate sex and relationship education in the home or at school, that they will turn to pornography to find out about sex. And if they get those negative, degrading images which abuse women in particular, then that is a very, very negative way of portraying sexuality, and it has potentially very negative knock-on effects in terms of male-female relations in the future.
Do you think we need to have a nanny state that kind of watches over some of this in a way? Because I sometimes look at, say, virtual reality, augmented reality. You know, we kind of glob porn into there, but one of the things we know, we were going to have an innovator up here doing this, but I know that Hers is out there, Dame, others that are in the pleasure business, so to speak, are working on avatars, are working on different ways that we can experiment with pleasure for whatever reason that may be. It was going to be part of the discussion we had planned to have up here today. I'm intrigued by it because I, myself, sort of look at it as a great and interesting journey and exploration. Is there anything wrong with that?
Well, let me say that my foundation is working with the British government and with members of Parliament to revise and reform relationship and sex education to address issues like pornography. You know, we need to educate young people about pornography, about the downside, that often it leads to unrealistic expectations, and that abuse of women, the degradation of women, is not acceptable. So we need to challenge toxic masculinity in our education classes in schools. We need to let young people know that what they see in pornography is not what they're likely to experience in real life. And just because the women actors in porn will do almost anything a man wants, doesn't mean to say that you as a man have a right to expect that of your girlfriend or your wife. That's one issue. The other issue is we're also challenging the way in which relationship and sex education is often about the risks and dangers and negatives of sex, and not enough about the pleasures and joys. So we want people to understand that having a happy, healthy, fulfilled sexual relationship with consent is fundamental to human happiness, and the education system has a fundamental role to play in that.
I love this question from Lab Guru. I apologize if I'm misspelling. How can we entrepreneurs contribute to this topic?
Well, of course, I would love to see more entrepreneurs in the tech world developing apps and programs, websites, whatever, about healthy, happy, fulfilling sexual relationships, how to have them, how to deal with problems in your relationship, how to deal with situations where a partner won't use a condom, what you can do to find pleasure for yourself and your partner. There's lots of education around these issues, responsible, positive education that can be done by the tech sector, which isn't being done right now by mainstream media, and it certainly isn't being done by the education system, although it should be.
We have a question here that is a provocative one, so let's ask it. There are people who want to have sex with children, pedophilia. Should society tolerate that? Let me reframe it for a minute. What should and how should our red lines, as our sexual identity evolves, our sexual norms evolve, how should red lines be established? And so we'll fit that with the pedophilia question.
Well, a lot of people have very complicated ideas about what are the basic parameters of good, healthy sexual relationships. But I would say there are three core principles. Shared consent, shared fulfillment, and shared respect. And consent, respect, and fulfillment have to be informed. A young child cannot give that. So we have to draw a red line that it's consent between adults that is acceptable, and that children should not be pressured, manipulated, or otherwise pushed into sexual relationships at an early age. We need to acknowledge that there is a problem with child sex abuse, and one of the programs that my foundation is pushing to the British government is that one of the reasons why child sex abuse happens is because young people feel ashamed and guilty about sex. And when they feel shame and guilt, they often won't report abuse because they feel bad about it. And abusers play on this. They use that fear, that shame, to silence young people. So if in our schools we can teach young people to have confidence and assertiveness training, to know that they have a right to say no to sex, that they should feel good about sex, they shouldn't feel ashamed about sex, they're much more likely to say no to sex they don't want, and they're much more likely to report abusers. And I think that's probably the single most effective way to reduce child sex abuse.
Do you think we need to have lines that are greater than they may exist now on things like revenge porn?
Well, quite clearly, revenge porn can be used, is being used, and is very damaging and distressing for the victims. It is an invasion of privacy.
But there are lots of places where there's no legal protection. Some where there is, but it's undefined.
Well, it goes against the fundamental principle of the right to privacy. I think the right to privacy should include protection against revenge porn.
Beatrice asks, how do we bring this education to our schools?
Well, you lobby politicians, you mobilize educators. So we work with teaching unions, the trade unions of teachers. We work often with school governors who have oversight over schools. We work with parents' groups. And of course, we work with members of parliament and government. Those core groups can be the vehicle of change. So even though in Britain we don't have the high level of relationship and sex education that we currently want, in some schools, because of the work of my foundation and others, such as the Sex Education Forum, which is a coalition of sex educators, teachers, and others, in some schools we already have that high quality standard. So some people are working in their own local communities to influence their local schools, their local school boards, to get those changes in place,
right,
even in advance of state or federal legislation.
I just want to say there's some fantastic questions up here on research on non-binary identities and how that can impact laws and how to ditch the binary male-female. There's a question up here about women and having to live in a world of double standards. There's another question up here about how do we make the discussion we're having up here less taboo. I would say have totally packed sessions like this at Web Summit. I want to thank all of you. These are fantastic questions. I want to thank Peter Tatchell. Thank you all. Thanks for a really great session and discussion. Thanks for being here.
Can I just finish with finish with a little inspirational motto? Don't accept the world as it is. Dream of what the world could be, and then help make it happen. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. Thank you.